Alistair Black sat in the stillness of his study. The room was a fortress of silence, panelled in dark wood that had absorbed 100 years of secrets. Light from a single green-shaded lamp pooled on the surface of his mahogany desk, illuminating a leather-bound ledger and his hands. His hands were old now, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, the skin a roadmap of faint, silvery scars. But they were steady. Always steady. Outside this room, his world was a symphony of noise and motion. Businesses, legal and otherwise, that churned with the relentless energy of a great machine. Men who moved at his command, their loyalty and absolute forged in fear and respect. Rivals who watched his every move, their envy a constant, low hum in the city's undercurrent. But in here, there was only the quiet scratch of his pen, the soft rustle of paper, and the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. It was the sound of control. The sound of order. He was a man who had built an empire on a simple, brutal principle: every action had a consequence, and every debt was paid. In his world, there were no accidents. There were no coincidences. There was only cause and effect, action and reaction, a merciless accounting that he himself oversaw. Tonight, the accounts were in order. The numbers aligned. The city slept, unaware of the invisible hand that kept its chaotic heart beating in a steady rhythm. Then came a sound that did not belong. A soft, hesitant knock on the study door. Alistair did not look up. His pen paused, hovering a millimeter above the page. No one knocked on this door. Not at this hour. Not ever. His instructions were explicit. When he was in his study, he was not to be disturbed. It was a rule as unbendable as iron. The knock came again, a little more urgent, a frantic little tap-tap-tap that sounded like a trapped bird. He lifted his head slowly. His eyes, pale and sharp beneath heavy brows, fixed on the door. Marco, his loyal shadow for 30 years, stood guard outside that door. Marco knew the rules better than anyone. For him to allow this, something was wrong. Or something was new. "Enter," Alistair said. His voice was quiet, a low rasp that carried the weight of command. It was a voice that never needed to be raised. The heavy door opened with a soft groan. It was not Marco. It was the new maid. Elena. A young woman, barely out of her teens, with wide, dark eyes that were currently filled with a terror so profound it seemed to steal the very air from the room. She was from somewhere far away, a place with more sun and less concrete. He knew this only because he made it his business to know everyone who worked under his roof. He knew she was quiet, diligent, and sent most of her meager earnings home to a sick mother. He knew she was invisible, as she was supposed to be. Until now. She stood clutching a feather duster in one hand and a folded, yellowed envelope in the other. Her knuckles were white. She trembled, a leaf in a storm. Marco appeared behind her, his face a mask of stone-cold apology and fury. He had his hand on her arm, ready to pull her away. "Boss, I am sorry," she insisted. She said. Alistair raised a single finger. Marco fell silent. His hand dropped from her arm. He took one step back, melting into the shadows of the hallway. A sentinel returned to his post. The message was clear. The girl would have her audience. This was the break-in protocol. The moment the world tilted off its axis. Every rule in Alistair's universe screamed that this girl should be dismissed, disciplined, perhaps even removed. But something in her sheer, unadulterated fear held him captive. It was not the fear of a subordinate who had made a mistake. It was the fear of someone who had seen a ghost. He looked at the envelope in her hand. It was old. The paper was brittle, the color of weak tea. "What is it?" he asked, his voice still unnervingly calm. Elena took a shaky step into the room. She seemed to shrink under his gaze, her small frame swallowed by the vastness of the study. "Mr. Black, sir. I am so sorry to disturb you. I was cleaning. In the library. The little wall safe. Behind the painting of the ship." He knew the one. A small, seldom used safe for old documents. He hadn't opened it in a decade. It was open, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Just a little. The door was not latched. I went to close it, I swear. That is all. I would never. And? Alastair prompted, his patience a thin, dangerous wire. I saw this. Inside. Just sitting on top, she took another hesitant step forward and placed the envelope on the edge of his desk, as if it were a bomb. She retreated immediately, her hands clasped in front of her. I saw the name. I thought. I do not understand. Alastair's eyes dropped to the envelope. Written in a faded, elegant script was a single name. Elena. His blood went cold. He stared at the name, then at the terrified young woman standing before him. He had hired her 3 months ago. He had learned her name from a personnel file. But he recognized the handwriting on the envelope. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it had been written over 20 years ago. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next is a testament to the fact that some promises have no expiration date, and some debts can only be paid with loyalty. If you enjoy stories about honor and unexpected kindness, do me a favor. Like this video, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. And in the comments, let me know what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's get back to it. Alastair Black was not a man given to sentimentality. He was a creature of logic and necessity. His world was a chessboard, and every person in it was a piece to be moved, sacrificed, or protected according to a grand, overarching strategy. His reputation had been built on this cold, calculating precision. In the city, his name was a synonym for power. It was whispered in boardrooms and back alleys, a name that could open doors or end careers. He was known as a man of his word. If Alastair Black gave you his word, it was better than any contract, safer than any bank vault. But the flip side of that coin was terrifying. If you broke your word to him, your world would be dismantled, piece by piece, with that same cold precision. There was no forgiveness in his ledger. Only balance. This rigid code was not born of choice, but of necessity. He had come from nothing. A hungry boy on the cold streets, where a moment of weakness was a death sentence and trust was a currency too expensive to afford. He had clawed his way to the top with his mind and his fists, learning early that control was the only real form of safety. He built walls around himself, not of brick and mortar, but of fear and mystique. There had been a time, long ago, when those walls had a door. There had been a woman, his wife, whose laughter could find its way through the cracks. And a daughter, whose small hand in his was the only thing that had ever made him feel truly powerful. But the world he inhabited was a hungry one. It took them from him, a cruel lesson in the price of his ambition. After that, he sealed the door permanently. The walls grew higher. The heart inside turned to stone. Or so he told himself. His organization ran on one core tenet: you do not touch family. It was a sacred rule. You could fight, you could steal, you could wage war in the streets over territory or pride, but the innocent, the wives, the children, the mothers, were off limits. To cross that line was to invite a wrath that was absolute and final. It was the one piece of his old self, the husband and father, that he had codified into the laws of his new kingdom. Now, this girl, Elena, stood in his fortress of solitude, a ghost from a past he had buried deep. She was everything his world was designed to crush. She was young, innocent, and vulnerable. Her life was a simple, straight line of hard work and quiet hope. She polished the furniture and dusted the shelves of his life, never once imagining the dark complexities that funded her small salary. She worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week. Every Friday, she took the bus to a small check-cashing store and wired more than half of her earnings to a small village he had never heard of. The money was for her mother, Isabella, who was fighting a sickness that the local doctors couldn't name. Elena's wages paid for medicine, for food, for the hope that her mother might live another year, another month, another day. Her finding the letter was, as she had said, a complete accident. The old safe, hidden behind a drab seascape, was a relic. The tumblers were worn, the locking mechanism prone to slipping. A vibration from her vigorous cleaning must have been enough to jog the bolt loose. She had seen the crack, a dark line against the wallpaper. Her duty was to report it or secure it. She had pushed the heavy steel door, intending to close it, and her eyes had fallen upon the single envelope lying inside. She saw her own name, and the world had stopped making sense. It was impossible. Who would leave a letter for her? And in this house? In a safe? She thought it was a test, or a cruel joke. But the paper was so old, the ink so faded. Curiosity warred with fear. Fear won, and it sent her running, envelope in hand, to the one man who was the source of all order and all fear in this house. She had broken every rule of her employment by knocking on that door, but the mystery of the letter was a hook she could not shake. Alistair stared at the envelope, then back at the girl. He could see the frantic pulse beating in the delicate skin of her throat. He could see the honesty in her wide, terrified eyes. She was not lying. She was not scheming. She was simply a girl who had stumbled upon a forgotten secret in a dusty corner of his life. A secret he had made a promise to keep. He picked up the envelope. The paper was dry and brittle, threatening to crumble in his grasp. He handled it with a strange reverence, his movement slow and deliberate. He did not need to open it. He knew what it said. He remembered the day it was written. He remembered Isabella. She had worked for him, too. Not as a maid, but as a bookkeeper, back when his empire was smaller, more volatile. She was brilliant, quiet, and possessed a fierce, protective loyalty. She saw the man he was, not the monster he was becoming, and she had trusted him. She had a daughter then, a baby named Elena. A child she adored with every fiber of her being. Isabella had gotten into trouble. Not of her own making. A man from her past, a vicious predator named Leo Gallo, had found her. He was a bottom feeder, a creature of greed and threats, and he wanted something from her. He had threatened her life, but worse, he had threatened her child. She had come to Alistair, not for protection, but for a promise. She was going to run, to disappear. She told him she had a plan to get away, to take her daughter somewhere Gallo could never find them. But she was a realist. She knew the world was a dangerous place. If anything happens to me, Alistair, she had said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes, if he finds me, I need to know she will be safe. She had handed him the letter. This is for her. For when she is old enough. It explains everything. And this, she had said, pressing a small, worn photograph of a smiling baby into his hand, is so you will recognize her. He had made the promise. I will keep them safe, he had told her. If she ever needs help, my door will be open. I give you my word. It was a promise made by a younger man, a man closer to the pain of his own loss. Isabella had disappeared a week later. Alistair had made inquiries. He learned that she and her daughter had made it back to their home country. He learned that Gallo had been searching for her, but the trail went cold. For a time, Alistair had his men keep an eye on things, but as the years passed, the file grew dusty. Gallo fell off his radar, becoming just another piece of the city's insignificant filth. The promise faded into a distant memory, locked away in a safe behind a painting of a ship. Until now. The universe, in its cruel and intricate way, had brought the promise to his doorstep. It had delivered the subject of that oath, the child from the photograph, into his home. A cosmic debt collector had arrived in the form of a terrified young maid. He looked at Elena, really looked at her, for the first time. He saw the shape of her mother's eyes, the same determined set of her jaw. She was Isabella's daughter, no doubt about it. And she was here. Which meant the fragile peace her mother had bought was over. Trouble had found her again. His internal world, so carefully ordered, was now in chaos. The promise was a ghost rising from the grave of his past. To honor it meant stepping back into a world of emotion he had long since abandoned. It meant caring. It meant exposing a vulnerability. His men, his enemies, they all knew him as an unfeeling monolith. An act of personal charity, of paternal protection for a mere maid. It was a crack in the armor. It was a risk. But then he looked at the envelope. His word. He had given his word. In his world, that was the only thing that truly mattered. It was the foundation of his entire empire. A man who did not keep his word was a man with no honor. And a man with no honor was nothing. He slid a silver letter opener from a sheath on his desk and slit the envelope with surgical precision. He unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. They were a mother's love letter to a daughter she was terrified of losing. It spoke of her hopes for Elena's future, her sorrow at their forced separation, and her undying love. And at the bottom, a single, chilling paragraph. If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have found the only man I ever trusted to keep you safe. His name is Alistair Black. He made me a promise. He will protect you from the man who has haunted our family. His name is Leo Gallo. Trust Mr. Black, my sweet Elena. He is a dangerous man, but his word is gold. Alistair folded the letter carefully, his movements precise and slow. He placed it on the desk beside the ledger. The past and the present, side by side. An old debt and a new one. He looked up at Elena, whose eyes were filled with a million questions. The choice was made. It had been made 20 years ago. Your mother was a good woman, he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. She was loyal. And she was smart. Elena's eyes widened, filling with tears. You knew her? I did, Alistair said. He tapped the letter. And I made her a promise. A debt. It seems the bill has come due. He pressed a small button on an intercom concealed on his desk. Marco. Come in. The door opened instantly. Marco stepped inside, his eyes flicking from Alistair to the girl and back again. He was waiting for the order to remove her. The order never came. Marco, Alistair began, his voice now devoid of any warmth, replaced by the cold, sharp edge of command. I have a new priority. This young lady, Elena. She is now under my personal protection. Arrange for a car to be available for her at all times. She is not to take the bus again. Move her into one of the guest suites in the West Wing. Effective immediately. Marco's professional composure finally cracked. A flicker of disbelief crossed his face. Boss? You heard me, Alistair said, his tone leaving no room for argument. She is to be treated as family. Anyone, and I mean anyone, who looks at her the wrong way, who speaks to her with anything but the utmost respect, will answer directly to me. Is that understood? Yes, boss. Understood, Marco said, his voice tight. He looked at Elena with a new, bewildered respect. Good, Alistair continued, his focus unwavering. Now for the real work. I want you to find out everything there is to know about her life. Who she talks to, who she sends money to, where that money goes. I want to know about her family back home. Their finances. Their health. Any pressures they might be under. I want a full picture, Marco. I want to know of any shadow that falls across her or her family. Use whatever resources you need. I want the report on my desk by morning. It will be done, Marco affirmed. Alistair paused, his eyes like chips of ice. There is one more thing. A name. Leo Gallo. He would be in his late 50s now. A small-time parasite. I want to know where he is. I want to know what he eats for breakfast. I want to know every dirty little secret he has. Find him. A predatory stillness settled over Alistair. It was the calm before a storm he had not unleashed in years. The accounts were no longer balanced. A debt was owed. And Alistair Black always paid his debts. The plan was not a plan at all. It was a conclusion. A final sentence in a story that had been written long ago. Marco's report arrived before sunrise, delivered on a tablet with encrypted files. Alastair read it in the grey light of dawn, a cup of black coffee steaming at his elbow. The information was thorough, efficient, and bleak. Leo Gallo had not faded into obscurity. He had festered. He had metastasized from a simple street-level predator into a slumlord, a loan shark, a bottom feeder who preyed on the desperate. He owned a dozen run-down apartment buildings in the poorest sections of the city, charging exorbitant rents for squalid conditions. His primary business, however, was preying on immigrants. He ran a network of informal lending, trapping people in a cycle of debt they could never escape. And he had found Isabella's family. It had taken him years, but his greed was a patient hunter. He had discovered the small village where Elena's mother lived. He couldn't touch her directly, not without drawing unwanted international attention. So he did what cowards do. He squeezed from a distance. He had manufactured a debt, a ridiculous sum tied to some long-forgotten family matter, and had used local thugs to enforce it. The payments Elena sent home were not just for medicine. A significant portion was being bled away by Gallo's proxies, a constant, draining threat against her mother's life. He had been extorting them for 3 years. Alastair closed the tablet. A cold, clean rage settled in his chest. Gallo had not just broken the rule about family. He had violated the memory of a woman Alastair had respected. He had turned a promise into a weapon of extortion. He had done it all while living in Alastair's city. Under Alastair's nose. This was not just business. It was an insult. He has an office, Marco said, standing silently by the desk. A real estate front in the warehouse district. He's there every morning by 9-inch. How many men? Alastair asked. 2. Amateurs. They carry, but they look soft. We won't need guns, Alastair said. This is not a negotiation. It is an audit. He stood up, the joints in his back cracking a soft protest. Get the car. You, me, and 2 others. No one else. Boss, maybe I should handle this, Marco suggested, a rare note of concern in his voice. It's beneath you. No, Alastair said, his eyes distant. This one is mine. A promise was made. The trip to the warehouse district was silent. Alastair sat in the back of the black sedan, watching the city wake up. He saw people rushing to jobs, children walking to school, the ordinary, beautiful rhythm of life. A world he observed but was no longer a part of. He was a ghost, an enforcer of unseen rules. Today, he would remind the city that some rules were absolute. Gallo's office was exactly as Alastair had pictured it. A grimy storefront with peeling letters that read Gallo Properties. The windows were dirty, the whole place exuding an aura of decay and desperation. They did not storm the entrance. Marco and another man went to the back, while Alastair and the third man walked calmly to the front door. It was locked. Alastair simply knocked. A moment later, the door was unlocked by a burly man with a cheap suit and a wary expression. He saw Alastair, an old man in a perfectly tailored coat, and his expression shifted to confusion. We're closed, the man grunted. Alastair smiled, a thin, cold expression that did not reach his eyes. No, you're not. You're liquidated. Before the man could process the words, Alastair's associate moved with a fluid, brutal efficiency. The man was disarmed and subdued in seconds, a hand clamped over his mouth, his eyes wide with shock and pain. The second guard, coming from a back room, met a similar fate at the hands of Marco. The entire takeover was silent, swift, and utterly final. The office was small and cluttered. A cheap metal desk was piled high with files and stained with coffee rings. Sitting behind it was Leo Gallo. He was balder now, fatter, his face puffy with cheap whiskey and sleepless nights. He looked up, his mouth opening to yell, but the sound died in his throat when he saw Alastair Black standing in the doorway. Recognition dawned, followed by pure, animal terror. Gallo's face went white. He knew who Alastair was. Everyone in their world knew. Black, he stammered, half rising from his chair. What is this? I have no business with you. I pay my dues. I stay in my lane. Your lane, Leo? Alistair said, walking slowly toward the desk. His footsteps were the only sound in the room. Your lane involves extorting the sick and the helpless. That is not a lane. It is a sewer. Alistair sat in the cheap client chair opposite the desk. He was perfectly calm. He reached into his coat and pulled out the yellowed envelope. He slid it across the desk. Gallo stared at it, confused. What is this? A ghost, Alistair said. From a woman you thought you'd buried. Her name was Isabella. Do you remember her? Gallo's face slackened. The name hit him like a physical blow. He remembered. Of course, he remembered. She was a smart woman, Alistair continued, his voice a low, conversational murmur. She knew what kind of animal you were. She knew you would never stop hunting her. So she took out an insurance policy. She came to me. She told me about you. About your threats. About her beautiful little girl. Alistair leaned forward, his pale eyes pinning Gallo to his chair. She made me promise that if anything ever happened to her, I would look after her daughter. I gave her my word. Gallo started to sweat, his breathing becoming ragged. I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't seen her in 20 years. No, you haven't, Alistair agreed. But you found her family, didn't you, Leo? You found a sick old woman in a poor village and you squeezed. You squeezed her for every penny her daughter could send. You used my promise as leverage against her. He paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle in the stale air. You broke a rule, Leo. The most important rule. You went after family. You preyed on the innocent. And you did it in my city. Alistair's voice dropped to a whisper, more menacing than any shout. You have been poisoning the ground I walk on. He stood up. The debt Isabella's family supposedly owes you is cancelled. Effective immediately. You will sign over the deeds to every one of these slum properties to a holding company I control. They will be renovated and the rents adjusted to fair market value. Your entire operation is finished. You will walk out of here with nothing. Gallo stared at him, a mixture of disbelief and terror on his face. You can't do that. This is my business. Everything I have is. What you have, Alistair interrupted, his voice like cracking ice, is a second chance. A chance to disappear. To leave this city and never come back. If I ever hear your name again, Leo, if you ever so much as think about contacting that family again, the consequences will be permanent. The threat was unspoken but absolute. It hung in the air, thick and suffocating. This was not a business negotiation. It was a death sentence, commuted. Marco placed a stack of legal documents and a pen on the desk. Sign. Leo Gallo, a man who had built his life on fear, was now consumed by it. His hands trembled so badly he could barely hold the pen. But he signed. Page after page, he signed away his squalid empire. When it was done, Alistair looked at him one last time, his face devoid of all emotion. Your business here is concluded. You will not be bothering anyone ever again. They left him there, a broken man in a ruined office. As they walked out into the morning sun, Marco glanced at his boss. What should we do with him? Let him go, Alistair said. A man with nothing is already a ghost. The threat was permanently closed. The books were balanced. The promise was kept. That evening, Alistair summoned Elena to the study once more. She entered with the same hesitation as the night before, but the terror in her eyes had been replaced by a deep, questioning confusion. Her life had been turned upside down in less than a day. She had been moved from her small, sparse room in the staff quarters to a luxurious suite with silk sheets and a private balcony. A car and driver had been assigned to her. The other staff now treated her with a mixture of awe and deference, whispering when she passed. She felt like she was in a dream. She stood before his desk, her hands clasped nervously. Alistair did not waste time with pleasantries. He pushed a thick folder across the mahogany surface. "These are for you." Elena stepped forward and opened the folder. Inside were official-looking documents filled with legal jargon she didn't understand. But she recognized certain words. She saw her mother's name. She saw the name of her village. She saw the letterhead of a bank. "I don't understand, sir," she said, her voice a whisper. "The first document," Alistair explained calmly, "is a confirmation that all outstanding debts held against your family have been paid in full. They are cancelled. No one will bother your mother for money again." Elena's eyes widened. She stared at the paper, her mind struggling to comprehend the words. The weight that had crushed her family for years, the constant source of her own anxiety and tireless work, was just gone. "The second document," he continued, "is the deed to your family's home. It is now in your mother's name. It belongs to her, free and clear." He paused, then pushed a small, discreet bank book across the desk. "And this is a trust fund I have established for your mother's medical care and your education. It is more than enough to ensure she receives the best treatment and that you can pursue any future you wish. You no longer need to work here, Elena. You are free." Tears began to stream down Elena's face, silent and overwhelming. She looked from the papers to the old man sitting before her, his face as stern and unreadable as ever. This act of impossible kindness, delivered with the cold efficiency of a business transaction, was too much to process. "Why?" she finally managed to ask, her voice choked with emotion. "Why would you do all this?" "I told you," he said simply. "I made a promise to your mother." She shook her head, trying to find the words. I can't repay you. I have nothing." She looked around the opulent room, at the life of immense wealth and power he commanded. "I can work for you for the rest of my life. I will do anything." "That will not be necessary," Alistair interrupted gently. He picked up the yellowed letter from his desk, holding it as if it were precious. "Your mother already paid me. 20 years ago. She gave me her trust. In my world, that is a currency worth more than money." He looked at her, his gaze holding a flicker of something she had never seen before, not pity, but a profound, weary understanding. "She gave me something else, too. A reminder. It is good to be reminded of what is right." Elena stared at him, this man who was feared throughout the city, this man who commanded legions of dangerous men and controlled a dark, sprawling empire. He was a paradox, a monster who had just acted like a saint. The confusion and gratitude warred within her, and a single, vital question rose to the surface. "Mr. Black," she asked, her voice small but clear. "Are you a good man?" The question hung in the silent room. It was a child's question, a question from a world of black and white, posed to a man who had lived his entire life in the grey. Alistair looked down at the old letter in his hand, at the faded script of a mother's love. He thought of the life he had lived, the things he had done, the violence and the fear he had wielded like a craftsman's tools. He thought of his own wife and daughter, lost so long ago. He thought of the promise he had just fulfilled. He looked back at the young woman before him, the living embodiment of that promise. "I am a man who keeps his promises," he answered. It was the only truth he had left. It was the only answer that mattered. He then pulled a simple, heavy card from a drawer in his desk. It was blank except for a single phone number etched in black ink. He held it out to her. "This is my personal number," he said. "If you or your family ever need anything, if any shadow ever falls on you again, you call this number. Day or night. It will be answered. You are under my protection. For life." It was not just an offer. It was a declaration. A shield that would now cover her and her family, invisible but unbreakable. Elena took the card, her fingers closing around it. It felt heavier than all the gold in that room. It was the weight of absolute safety. It was the final, indelible payment of a 20-year-old debt. 5 years passed. The world turned, and lives changed. In a bright, sterile hospital wing filled with the quiet beeps of monitors and the scent of antiseptic, a young woman moved with calm, confident purpose. Her name was Elena, but she was no longer a maid. Her uniform was now the crisp blue scrubs of a registered nurse. The trust fund Alastair had created had done more than save her mother's life, which it had, with the help of the best doctors and treatments money could buy. It had also given Elena a future her mother had only dreamed of. She had enrolled in nursing school, her diligence and compassion making her a natural. She had excelled. Now, she spent her days easing the pain of others, a healer in a world that had shown her both its harshest cruelty and its most unexpected grace. Her family was safe. Her mother was healthy, living peacefully in the home that was now truly hers. The shadow of Leo Gallo was a distant, faded memory, a horror story from another lifetime. Elena was happy. She was fulfilled. She was free. She still had the card with the single phone number, tucked away in a safe place. She had never had to use it. She knew, with an unshakable certainty, that she never would. The protection it promised was so absolute that no threat dared to materialize. Far away, in a quiet study paneled in dark wood, an old man sat at his desk. Alastair Black was older now, his movement slower, the lines on his face carved deeper by time and gravity. His empire continued to run with its relentless, mechanical precision, but he was more of an observer now, a chairman emeritus of the dark world he had built. The ledgers were still there, but he rarely looked at them anymore. The numbers no longer interested him. His gaze was often drawn to a small, simple object that sat in a place of honor on his otherwise immaculate desk. It was not a trophy, or a jewel, or a symbol of his immense wealth. It was a single, yellowed envelope, preserved under a glass paperweight. Sometimes, in the deep quiet of the night, he would lift the glass and run his fingers over the brittle paper, feeling the faint indentations of the script. He would read the name, Elena, and remember the terror in a young girl's eyes, the trust in her mother's voice, the clean, sharp feeling of a promise fulfilled. His men still spoke of it in hushed, reverent tones. That Elena matter, they called it. It had become a legend within the organization, a story that defined the old man's code. It was a lesson to the younger, more ambitious members of his world, that power without honor was meaningless, and that the only legacy that truly endured was the one written in the lives you chose to protect. The memento on his desk was a constant, silent sermon on the nature of true strength. For in a life filled with complex calculations of risk and reward, of violence and profit, that single act of pure, uncomplicated decency had become the most important entry in his final ledger. It was the one debt he was truly proud to have paid. In the end, a person's character is not defined by the power they accumulate or the fear they command. It is measured by the promises they keep. It is found in the quiet moments of choice, when they are asked to stand for something beyond their own self-interest. Courage is not always a roar, sometimes, it is the quiet voice at the end of the day saying, I will try again tomorrow, or, in the case of Alastair Black, it was the gravelly whisper of an old promise, an echo of honor that traveled across 2 decades to save a life, proving that even in the darkest of worlds, the choice to protect innocence is a light that can never be extinguished.